I'm Mindy Peterson, and this is Enhanced Life with Music, where we explore the practical ways music transforms everyday life, health, happiness, and beyond. I think that all of us at some point have worried about memory issues, forgetting names, or maybe why we walked into a room. Maybe we've seen loved ones slip away into a fog of dementia. That's true for me, and wonder if that will be our destiny. Other common brain concerns are trouble focusing. Maybe you worry or know that you have ADHD, or you've suffered from a concussion and are wondering if your brain will ever fully recover. Or you simply want to know how to stay mentally sharp as you age. My guest today is convinced that Alzheimer's and dementia can be delayed, prevented, and in some cases reversed, and that your brain can become sharper, more focused, and more resilient with time. Dr. Majid Fotuhi is a world renowned neurologist and medical doctor who is redefining how we think about aging, intelligence, and brain health. He teaches at Johns Hopkins University, George Washington University, and Harvard Medical School. He is the author of multiple books, the latest of which just released. It's called The Invincible Brain, the clinically proven plan to age-proof your brain and stay sharp for life. He's here today to discuss this brand new book and how music can play a role in enhancing brain vitality and cognitive performance at any age. Welcome to Enhanced Life with Music, Dr. Fotuhi.
Thank you very much for having me on your podcast, Mindy. I really appreciate it.
I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I loved your book. And as a healthy lifestyle junkie, there's so much that I love to talk about, but I'm going to discipline myself and try to stick to the aspects that are relevant to music, since that's the scope of this podcast. But first of all, before we get into anything musical related, I'm wondering if you can just explain to listeners why you wrote this book, because I found the reasons so compelling. It sounds like it started with concerns that you had during your residency about Alzheimer's being overdiagnosed and being presented as an incurable disease. And that concern was followed up by your own experiences in clinical practice, where you saw dramatic results in just 12 weeks with your own patients. So tell us a little bit more about these experiences that you had and how they led to this book.
Yes, that was exactly right. When I was in medical school at Harvard, I became interested in the brain particularly, and I decided that I wanted to become a neurologist. And when I started my neurology residency at Johns Hopkins, I saw a lot of patients who were diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, but they had many treatable conditions at the same time. For example, let's say a 78-year-old who has significant diabetes, some degree of depression, takes a lot of medications, is depressed, and is home alone. All of those factors can cause memory loss. And yet these patients were diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And I thought, wait a minute, we shouldn't really labeling them as having Alzheimer's disease. They have a soup of problems in their brains due to vascular problems, inflammation, and poor rinsing and cleaning of the brain, and some degree of what we call Alzheimer's disease, which is accumulation of these proteins in the brain called amyloid and tau. So we have a series of reversible things: depression, diabetes, sleep apnea, obesity, sedentary lifestyle, isolation, all that things. And then we have these stubborn little proteins that for some reason aggregate. And when they aggregate, they become like a piece of gum. And they become insoluble, and they cause inflammation in the brain, and they cause brain shrinkage. So a group of things that are reversible cause brain shrinkage, and these two proteins, which we call neurodegenerative disease, cause problems. And yet most people had a combination of these things in their brain. They may have been like 80% vascular metabolic things and 20% plaques and tangles. And there were patients who had like 70% plaques and tangles and 30% other things. But it was never the case that like an 85-year-old had only plaques and tangles and nothing else. This was very rare, if at all. So I felt, well, why aren't we treating the treatable components? These other stubborn proteins are difficult, and we'll have to figure out a way to handle them. But why we just tell people they have Alzheimer's disease and we park them in a nursing home and let them have a miserable end to their life? Why don't we
Mhm.
try? And even more importantly, why don't we educate people to treat these treatable things in midlife?
Sure.
Because the damage they cause, the shrinkage they cause in the brain is cumulative over decades. So if you're 45 years old and you have high blood pressure and you have poor sleep and you snore at night and you don't exercise, all of those are going to shrink your brain just a little tiny bit every day. But over 30 years, that becomes significant shrinkage. And that's why I wrote my first book in 2002 called The Memory Cure, where I talk about just what I just told you.
Yeah.
And in 2009, I realized that there are many things that actually grow the brain. So first I was talking about stop doing things that shrink your brain, but then new evidence started coming up in the literature that showed that regular exercise increases the volume of the brain areas that are important for memory. For example, an area called hippocampus, which is the size of your thumb. There's one on the right, one on the left. And this part of the brain is critically important for learning new things. So, for example, if you learn how to play the piano, the learning part happens in the hippocampus.
Mhm.
So then I said, wait a minute, that's so interesting. So, if somebody didn't have any negative risk factors, but wanted to increase their brain capacity, to increase their brain resilience, so that they will be more resilient at age 80, if some plaques and tangles appear out of nowhere, the brain is stronger to fight back. That was incredible. So I wrote 2 articles in a very prestigious journal called Nature, and I talk about these things. And it was to me a breakthrough. But people usually want a drug. And so the emphasis always was let's try to find a drug for these 2 proteins, and these other things will somehow resolve themselves.
Well, and it was so interesting in your book how you talk about the proteins, the presence of the proteins doesn't necessarily
Exactly.
result in dementia. Like, yeah, I won't go into that, but that was really
Yeah.
interesting.
For example, a study called the Nun study showed that if you look at elderly women, sisters who live in monasteries, they teach, they pray, they do community work, they drive, they do things, they don't stress usually that much. These people's brains were functioning much better than expected. Many of these sisters had significant load of pathology, of Alzheimer's pathology, these plaques and tangles in the brain, yet they had no symptoms. Their brains were very resilient to the effects of Alzheimer's in the brain. So, as a neurologist, I figured, well, if all these things are true, what if they made a program and put all of these good things together and work with patients to reduce their bad habits and give them new habits, then we should see results. If it's all true, then if I had a neurology center and I did all this thing, I should be able to see a result in 9 months. So I
Yeah,
started,
so reduce the things that are shrinking the brain and increase the things that we know will grow the brain or increase that brain capital or brain reserves.
right. So up to that point in 2010, 2011, all the studies had described how people who exercise, for example, grow their brain, or how people who reduce stress can improve their brain, how meditation grows the brain, how obesity shrinks the brain. But nobody, to my knowledge, had put all of them into one program. These were
Mm.
in academic centers, and people have done research on it. But I argued, well, if I have an office and I have coaches who help people address these things, then we should see results technically, right? I mean, it should work. And then I started a program in 2012, and the program was 9 months. And as I did these things with this elderly who were usually 60s, 70s, and early 80s, we saw results much faster. So I decided 9 months is too much, 6 months is enough. And then I realized, no, even 3 months seems to be good. So then I made 3 months. So how about 6 weeks? Didn't work. 6 weeks was
Oh, okay. So 12 weeks is the magic, the minimum amount necessary for the maximum results, anyways.
people to come to our brain center twice a week, 90 minutes each time. And we did brain training and life coaching. And so within 12 weeks, that seemed to be the optimal time for most people. And so I had several patients who came in really convinced they have Alzheimer's disease. They were not talking much, they were repeating themselves, The family was convinced that this is it, and they wanted me to just confirm the diagnosis. And I thought, wait a minute, let's give him a chance. And many of them improved. So then I started doing MRIs on their brains to see if all these things we do that seem to be improving their symptoms, does it actually grow the brain so much so that we can see on MRI? Keep in mind that, when we talk about things at the brain level, we're talking about the microscopic level. Neurons are born, blood vessels are generated, synapses are formed. It's all microscopic. But could it be enough that we can see it on MRI with naked eye? And this is what happened. About half our patients had grown their hippocampus by about 1 to 3%. Keep in mind that hippocampus usually shrinks about 1% per year after age 50. So growing your
Oh,
brain, the hippocampus by 3% in 3 months is equivalent of making someone's brain younger equivalent of 3 years younger in brain age, just 12 weeks. So
yeah, I just want to say that again so listeners hear this. So the MRI results showed that more than half of your patients had grown the size of their hippocampus by 3% or 1 to 3%. And that meant that their brains had become about 3 years younger in that 12-week time when typically they would be losing size and mass as they age. It's
absolutely.
pretty amazing.
It was amazing to me. So I thought maybe, oh, I just got lucky. This is actually the first patient I saw. It was the best case we saw. I wasn't the first case. One of the first patients I saw had many problems, and we really gave her intensive training. And she had 8%, which was the best. Usually it's about 1 to 3%. Anyway, so I thought maybe just, oh, this is too good to be. I remember one day I went to work. I used to go to work at 4 a.m. just getting ready for my day, and the radiology report came, and this person's brain had grown, and I couldn't believe it. So I provided this program for more patients, and we saw 129 patients with a diagnosis of MCI. MCI stands for mild cognitive impairment. Is a condition between normal and Alzheimer's disease. These are people who are very forgetful, get confused sometimes, but they're still driving and doing things, but they really are not normal. This is stage between
Sure.
normal and Alzheimer's. And so we saw that 84% of our patients had objective improvements in their cognitive tests. It wasn't that just that told me they felt better. When we did computerized cognitive testing on them, independent cognitive testing on them, 84% of them had improved their cognitive functions. That was amazing. These are patients who were one step away from Alzheimer's disease, and yet we made them normal again.
Wow.
And it was wow, exactly. I sent that article to the Journal of Prevention of Alzheimer's Disease, was accepted. And we had a picture of the patients, and you can see MRI before and after. It's actually in my website, drfotuhi.com, if you want to look at it, those papers. So then I was so excited. In 2015, I started a brand new office here in Northern Virginia near Washington, D.C. And we made the program more structured. I hired brain coaches who usually had a bachelor's degree or master's degree in psychology or social work. And I trained them based on my publications and my books and papers how to encourage patients to change their behavior. We used,
And I'll just jump in and point out too that, like you said, this was the same results with people whether they had more advanced dementia or if it was mild cognitive impairment. But you also had these same dramatic results with patients that had ADHD and patients that had post-concussion syndrome,
yes,
right?
just to be
And this is
clear,
all ages. It wasn't just
yeah,
elderly.
this was not the case for people with advanced dementia. This is only for people who had mild cognitive impairment or mild
Ah,
Alzheimer's disease, not advanced
okay. Okay, so you had these dramatic results with mild cognitive impairment
or
and also ADHD and post-concussion
people with
syndrome?
mild Alzheimer's disease. So, there's a cognitive testing called MoCA, which is from 1 to 30, and usually 24 is considered a borderline when if they're around 24, called mild cognitive impairment. If they're 28, it's considered okay, normal. If it's considered 19, that's dementia. So we had patients who were like 20 to 29, that range. If somebody
Okay.
didn't know what year it was, or they don't recognize family members, unfortunately, that was too late.
Okay.
So then,
Well, and just for time's sake, I'm just going to fast forward a little bit and say that for 12 years, you had patients flying in from across the country to your clinic. You were booked solid 7 days a week. 12 hours a day. And you came to the conclusion that people could take advantage of these tools and these resources right from their own home. Tell us a little bit about that, how you decided to retire from this practice and write this book as a result of the success you were seeing in your clinic.
Yeah, well, our office was open from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. every day, and it was solid books. We had 25 brain coaches, and
Amazing.
managing this was becoming quite a job of, 7 days a week, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Well, like Sunday night, Saturday night, the office was full. And
Wow.
thanks to my wife, we were able to manage and keep everything organized. And I realized there's a need for this. And so I decided, I can't just keep repeating myself to 100 or so patients every week in my office and tell them the same thing over and over again. I really need to bring this up to a national level. And the best way to do that would be through writing a book, putting together
Ah,
an app, do an online course, and do public health education through giving lectures. And I'm so glad I did that because I love doing it. Now I am an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University, and I teach a whole course about these things. It's called Advanced.
wonderful, because that's another great way to extend the ripple effect of all of this teaching is to teach the next generation of physicians.
Exactly. Exactly. So I'm loving it these days, and I'm very excited about the book being available for public and going around giving lectures. I'm doing a lot of podcasts, and I find that I'm in my element. I think
Sure.
people need to find a sense of purpose, what drives them, what excites them. And I feel so excited that I can share the good news that, listen, every person can grow to their 60s, 70s, and early 80s and remain sharp and independent. Only a small percentage of people, maybe 5%, maybe 7%, have genes that determine either they stay sharp no matter what they do, or unfortunately, they decline despite doing everything right.
Ah,
Genes play a small role for late life Alzheimer's disease. It's different from early onset Alzheimer's disease, where genes do play an important role for a 50-year-old or 40-year-old or 55-year-old. Genes are primarily cause of Alzheimer's disease. But that early onset Alzheimer's disease accounts for less than 2-3% of all Alzheimer's disease cases in the world. 97%, 95% have a mixed pathologies in the brain, and most of those things are treatable, and genes play a very small role.
mm. Well, it's so encouraging to hear that we have agency, we have control over a lot of what's happening with our brain size, our brain health, our brain reserves. And I'm so excited that you've written this book. And I'll point out to listeners that this book, part 3 of the book, takes your brain fitness program that you were so booked with in your clinic and puts it into this book. So listeners can access that for themselves in the third part of your book. So there's so much you talk about in the book, including pillars of brain health. You talk about all those different factors that feed into this Alzheimer's soup, as you called it, and you reference that in your book, which I think is such a helpful metaphor to think about, where you talk about diabetes and obesity can play a factor in this. In fact, I've heard multiple times that diabetes is considered now like a type 3 um, Alzheimer's, I think or Alzheimer's is considered a type 3 diabetes, I guess is how it's termed. But there's so many of these different factors and elements that feed into the Alzheimer's soup. And I love that you've broken out those different factors and talked about the ones that can be addressed that we have agency over. So you talk about the pillars of brain health, but steering toward the topic of music and the scope of our discussion and the topic of this podcast, you said that prevention of cognitive decline is not only possible, but realistic. Talk to us about what role music can play in age-proofing the brain, preventing dementia, and enhancing brain vitality at any age.
I think music is one of the best ways to keep your brain young. And I would strongly recommend playing music, listening to music, and doing things like singing, dancing, and so forth. Just to put this in perspective, there are 5 pillars of brain health: exercise, sleep, nutrition, stress reduction, and brain training. So, musical training, when you learn to play a musical instrument, really activates multiple networks in your brain. Your brain is like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. Now, the good thing about music is that often You have to use multiple parts of your brain to learn a new musical instrument. And that really challenges the brain and pushes the brain to create new neurons, new synapses, new connections. When you go to a gym and you exercise, they say no pain, no gain. And when you play a musical instrument, you get frustrated because you want to hold, for example, the guitar. You're just changing a note, and it gives the wrong one. As you're hitting the wrong one, and it gets frustrating. Well, that frustration is the same as the pain and the discomfort an athlete would experience when they bench press 200 pounds.
Oh, it's interesting to hear it put that way. I haven't heard it
And
explained that way, but that makes sense.
yeah, so it's frustrating because, you just want to move on and it just doesn't seem to go. And so your brain is like a muscle. The more you stimulate it, the stronger it gets. And the beauty of music is that it activates multiple brain networks. Let's say you learn a new language. When you learn a new language, you're focusing your brain on areas of the brain that are important for the language, which is like 3 or 4 patches of the brain in a network that includes 8 nodes. So you really are working those 8 nodes, and you're also working the attention part. But if you're learning to play the guitar, you have to keep track of your fingers, you have to be listening to music, you're reading music, and you're sequencing your fingers. Whether it's a piano, the guitar, the flute, or you're learning to sing, all of those things activate multiple brain areas at once. And that's what the beauty of music is. And that's why I recommend learning an instrument. And, also I like dancing. My direction in music is through dancing. I love to dance. I do tango, cha-cha, waltz.
Oh,
And I love to just immerse myself in the music and let the music move my body. I love that. And I know for a fact that the music not only is challenging my brain, not only is pushing me to create new synapses, new pathways in the brain, but it also has a calming effect. I feel
mm,
calmer when I dance. I feel relaxed because while I'm dancing, while I'm keeping track of the steps, like I'm doing this, and the next step's going to be this, and after that's going to be that. But while I'm thinking of what it will be, meanwhile, I need to pay attention to what I'm doing now. So I'm really cross-training my brain, and while I'm doing these things, I can't be worrying about the politics or the mortgage or the kids or weather. I'm so consumed with all these things that are my brain being challenged with. And that's
sure,
relaxing. That's so refreshing. And our dancing is really refreshing. And the
sure.
third element of dancing for me is an element of socializing. When you go to dance parties or you go to ballroom dancing classes, it's a social event. So music can improve brain functions 3 ways. It challenges the brain, it relaxes the brain, and it has the reward associated with the social aspect of it when there is a social component. And for all
Ah.
these reasons, I think that that's a no-brainer. You really,
Nice pun there.
yeah. I think passive listening to music obviously is the bottom of the list. If you're just having some music on while you're driving, that's really the least interaction can have with music. Some relaxation component maybe. So I think if that's what you're doing, you could, perhaps make a playlist for yourself. You use the brain areas for music and sort of categorize the different songs and put them in an album and a playlist for yourself so that you have like 3 playlists.
I was never a coffee drinker until about 3 years ago, after my sister coaxed me into trying espresso. I have to admit, I loved that caffeine boost and the strong flavor of espresso. But I saw that people who drank it every day didn't even feel that caffeine boost anymore, and they felt horrible and got headaches if they didn't have their morning caffeine. So I let myself have espresso a few days a week, and I went in search of a morning beverage for the rest of the days, something that would still boost my mental clarity and energy. I was thrilled when I discovered mud water. It was created by an artist and dad who used to be addicted to coffee. He started to blend mushrooms like lion's mane, cordyceps, reishi, and chaga with superfoods and spices. I've become a huge fan of the original masala chai, a blend that supports gut health and immune function, along with energy and focus. Try it yourself and get 20% off your first order at mudwater.com/enhance life. Mudwater is spelled Mudwtr. A link is in the show notes. In your book, you quote a very widely cited study from 2024 in The Lancet that highlighted the importance of prevention for dementia. And in the study, they talk about how not to get Alzheimer's, and they had, I think, 14 different lifestyle factors. And you kind of translate those into a list of actions. So instead of don't do this, it's do this. And the number one thing, I don't know if this was by design, by priority or not, but the number one thing was keep learning new things, which obviously we've been talking about and has high relevance to playing a musical instrument or making music. Another one was make social connections. And as you pointed out, music is highly social, whether it's involved in dance or whether it's involved in singing in a choir or playing in an orchestra or a band. Even just listening to music can be so beneficial. Like there's been studies about why do we love listening to sad music? It seems counterintuitive, but when we hear somebody singing a sad song and we're sad, it makes us feel less alone. We know that the person who wrote these lyrics, they've experienced similar situations to what we're experiencing. So there is such a social aspect of music. In fact, it's been called social glue before. And you mentioned music can relax the brain, and definitely stress can be a component too that can feed into that Alzheimer's soup that you mentioned.
Yes, and these are not hypothetical. These are facts, and these have clinical applications. Several studies have shown that if you take a group of older adults, even people who have, for example, Parkinson's disease, and provide them with musical training, their brain improves and their function improves. They can function better after 3 months of learning a musical instrument.
You say in your book, too, that neurologists tend to say, and you say this, that practice makes cortex. And I found that interesting because I taught piano lessons for years, and piano teachers, and you've probably heard this before, we like to say practice makes perfect. And you talk in the book about how practice grows the brain and increases the thickness of the cortex. And that's why you say practice makes cortex. So, all of you music teachers who are listening to this, in addition to saying practice makes perfect, I want you to talk to your students and their parents about how practice makes cortex.
So cortex is the outer layer of the brain, which is important for all our higher cognitive functions, things like reading, writing, typing, cooking, doing your taxes, everything we do, all our higher cognitive functions emerge from cortex and hippocampus. So the cortex and hippocampus together are the seat of consciousness. They're the place where cognitive functions emerge. And different parts of the cortex are are nodes in networks that do different functions. For example, I talk about a language network. So we need to understand language, and we need to make sense of language and articulate our response. Not all of the brain is involved in doing that. Like 8, 10, 12 nodes form networks, and the network of connections between these handles you understanding a language and responding appropriately. Now, if you learn how to play golf, then you're going to use parts of your cortex and hippocampus that are important for learning correct posture, hand-eye coordination, to hit the ball. And when you learn to play the piano, you really use like 70% of your brain. More, you really maximize using a lot of parts of your brain because you're listening to music, you're reading your notes, you sequence your hand movements, you're planning your movements, you're paying attention. That's why music is extra good when it comes to brain training. And any of those things you do literally grow the parts of the cortex and the hippocampus that correspond to those functions. So you get of your cortex like a blanket, or you can think of it as a mosaic of nodes, and every 10, 12, 14 nodes form little networks. And sometimes when you do one thing, you're using one network. For example, I can ask you to sit down and take a deep breath. I want you to pay attention to the air going to your nostrils and just focus on that. So when you do that, you're using your brain because you're using the attention network to maintain your attention on the sound of the air going to your nostrils. So you're using one, or particularly the front of the brain. You're not using all your brain. But in contrast, when you're learning a musical instrument, you're using so parts of the brain. And every time you use a brain, networks of the brain, and the more connectivity they have, they grow. Like a muscle that when you stimulate it, it grows. Those parts of the brain grow first at a microscopic level. You can't see it with naked eye. But many hundreds of studies have shown that different types of brain training corresponds to increase the volume of cortex and hippocampus. So whatever you do that challenges different parts of the cortex and hippocampus grows them, so much so that we can see them on a brain MRI before and after interventions.
Well, I love in the book how you talk about the different types of memory and the different memory networks: short-term memory, working memory, long-term memory, procedural memory, which is probably like when you talked about dancing. You don't have to consciously think about every single move you're making because of that procedural memory that your body has. And so that was really interesting. And then you talked about cognition and cognitive skills. Like we talk about cognition, what actually is cognition? And you say it consists of mental processes that help you acquire knowledge, make sense of the world through your experiences and senses. And when you talked about the abilities that we gain with cognition, the ability to focus, control impulses, switch back and forth between different tasks, pay attention to certain things and not others, spot patterns, solve problems, all of those things that you mentioned, I just was thinking, all of those higher brain functions are exercised in learning a musical instrument.
Absolutely. And that's why I'm a fan myself. I'm a fan because I've seen the literature that supports the profound benefits of music, from stimulating the brain, relaxing the brain, and the social element. And like I said, that's a no-brainer.
I'm really curious to get your input on this question that I have for you. So I know someone who had a concussion about 6 months ago, is working, his physician sent him to a therapist to deal with some post-concussive symptoms. It's actually a speech therapist that he was sent to, which kind of surprised me a little because he's not having any problems with speech, but apparently this person has training in post-concussive treatment. So this therapist has him doing a lot of brain exercises. And when he was describing the exercises, okay, so it was things like, you're at a restaurant with four other people. This is what everybody ordered. This is what the cost of each meal was. In your brain, calculate the tax and tip on each of these individual orders, add them together, figure out what each person ordered, things like that. And I thought, well, okay, that probably is challenging your brain, but there's no relevance to real life in this exercise because we all have smartphones that will do that for us. And it also does not sound nearly as interesting as picking up that instrument that you learned when you were a kid. I'm wondering, would it be just as effective for a patient like this to do something that is interesting, that he wants to do, like take up a musical instrument, rather than something that in my mind is sort of pointless? Because once he finishes working with his therapist, he's not going to have to use those exercises anymore. What are your thoughts on that?
I recommend that people engage in exercises that they find interesting and fun. If the exercise is not interesting, people are not going to continue with it. And there are so many ways to stimulate your brain. You might as well pick one you like. It's not like there are only
Okay.
choices. There are probably 50 choices. In my book, as you see, on the end of the chapter for brain training, I have a list of at least 20, 30 things that people can try. You can learn a new hobby. You can play video games. You can go to the nature and learn about different plants. You can go fishing. You can, there's so many things people can do. And I recommend that people pick something they like. When it comes to concussion, the brain needs rehabilitation, but the rehabilitation needs to be guided and it should not be frustrating. Because if it's frustrating, it adds to, the problems patients have. It needs to be very carefully selected and patients need to enjoy it. So I think musical instruments are great because you learn something that's useful. I mean, you can do it in the future. It's not like some Sudoku you do that's good for you, but at the end of it, you just done Sudoku. But if you learn the good piano, the guitar, or dancing, you actually learn something useful you can do.
Right. Is there any chance that those, in my mind, sort of arbitrary and random brain exercises would exercise a part of the brain that wouldn't be exercised in one of those other options, whether it's playing a musical instrument or something else? Is that possible that this therapist had those exercises designed for a certain purpose?
Yes. So when somebody has a concussion, they will have problems with different part of the cortex. A person may have had a concussion that affects the frontal lobe, which make it more challenging for things like executive functions, maintaining attention, or it could be a side of the brain where it can affect the difficult, orientation and find navigation, or it can affect this part of the brain that may get affect the problem, cause problems with calculation and numbers, or affect memory or vision. So I told you that the cortex, like a mosaic of nodes that form networks. And so it's possible that a whole bunch of nodes related to attention get affected. In that case, the person needs physical therapy for attention, so to speak. And then so they need to pick up exercises that challenge the attention capacity of a patient. Whereas another person may have difficulty with executive function and sequencing movements, and they need a different type of training. Another person
Okay.
with language, so that person may benefit from language training. Another person may have difficulty with memory, and they will have problem. They will benefit from memory training. That's why it really needs to be tailored to specific patients' needs.
Okay. But playing a musical instrument does address most of those
Yes.
areas of the brain, right?
I think the advantage of, for example, learning to play the guitar is that it affects all of them. I told you how playing musical instruments, learning to play musical instruments really challenges so many parts of the brain at the same time. So many
Sure.
brain networks get activated simultaneously, and that's why they're powerful.
So if this person doesn't really like doing these random, arbitrary, again, in my mind, exercises, brain exercises, would it make sense that a person in a situation could ask the therapist, what exact part of the brain or what brain network are you wanting to strengthen? And are there other more enjoyable ways that I can do that? Would
Yeah.
that be
I think a speech therapist will be familiar with cognitive testing, and cognitive tests usually take an hour, 2 hours, sometimes 6 hours, depending who does it, really map out a person's strengths and weaknesses. So, for example, if you do cognitive testing, your memory may be 80%, your executive function may be 90%, your verbal fluency may be 60. I'm just, any person has variable
sure,
weaknesses. And so if someone has concussion, their memory may be 20%, executive function may be 10%, but the processing speed may be 80%. So then that
sure.
person needs to work on the areas where cognitive function has been affected.
Sure. So really, they could even take your book with that list of all the activities that you list out as options and take that to their therapist and say, which of these that I find more interesting would work the same part of my brain that you're trying to work,
I think it's
right?
really important that they enjoy it. See, when we have brain
Sure.
coaches in the office, the brain coaches will play, chess with someone because chess is
Ah,
great for maintaining your attention,
yeah.
good for executive function.
Yeah.
Or, they'll play card games with them, or they play Monopoly. It would play something that is fun and engaging, and it doesn't feel like a chore.
Yeah. Well, and related to that, you talk quite a bit about in the book too about happiness and purpose and how that translates to brain health. Thoughts and emotions have a direct correlation to brain chemistry, and brain chemistry goes back to thoughts and emotions. So it's like this two-way street, and happiness and purpose really can have a direct impact on depression and cognitive function or dysfunction. So that was really interesting. So that also makes sense that if you're doing an exercise that you enjoy and makes you happy and brings you purpose, because you'll be able to use this in your life, like playing a musical instrument, that would definitely make more sense than doing something that you feel is irrelevant to your future life.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, people don't always appreciate that the thought and emotion parts of the brain are tightly intermingled. And your thoughts can make you happy, and happiness can bring you good thoughts. So you can always start by controlling your good thoughts and think positive, and that brings better feelings, and the better feelings are going to help you have more positive thoughts. And so you can have some control over the link between thoughts and emotions in your brain. You're not just passive, you can have an active role on how you feel every day.
Yeah. Well, we touched just briefly on some of the different types of memory. You talk about it a lot in your book about memory networks. One thing that I want to bring out in this conversation too is that you talk about how memory is emotional. And music is the sound of emotions, or it's been called the sound of emotions. And it's really interesting in the book about how you talk about almost all the memories from our distant past involve strong emotions. When you think about your first kiss or the first time you held a brand new baby, or something like that, there's strong emotions that are associated with those. Talk to us just briefly about the role that music plays in this emotional memory component.
Yes, the part of the brain for emotions is very close to the part of the brain for memory. In fact, hippocampus, the part of the brain for learning and memory, is also a part of the network for emotions. Remember, I told you that there were networks in the brain? Well, there's also a network for emotions, and things that are emotional are remembered better. In fact, can you think of any memory you have from your life that was not emotional? The reason you remember it is because it was emotional. Otherwise, you would never remembered it. I mean, you've had so many breakfasts in your life, so many lunches, so many dinners, but all the things, there's probably one or two dinners that you still remember, and there was something emotional that happened. It was perhaps where you met your spouse, or a dinner where somebody offered you a job, or a dinner where you had an aha moment about a business. So
Yeah.
emotions really strongly impact what we remember. And one of the things that are good about music is that it really plays with emotions. When I see a violinist go into it, oh my God, they're become one with their instrument. They're like so into it emotionally, and I think that's how you can train the emotional network of the brain while you're also training these other networks in the brain.
Love that. Well, as you can tell, I'm a huge fan of your book. I definitely recommend that listeners go out and get their hands on it and find out all the many ways that you can address this soup of factors that contribute to either brain reserves and brain growth or shrinking the brain. And you make it clear in your book that no matter where you are on the brain spectrum right now, no matter what age you are right now, there are many things that you can do to either progress or decline. The choice is yours. And you give so many practical resources in the book. One favorite quote of mine that I'll mention and close as we wrap up here is this. In your book, you say, suppose you want to age gracefully, not just avoid Alzheimer's disease, but remain sharp, mobile, energetic, and able to pursue your passions and purpose. In that case, there is a straightforward formula. Keep growing your brain. The more neurons, synapses, and fiber bundles you have, the greater your brain reserve will be. That translates into more efficient and harmonious connections between your brain networks, and your brain will be better able to resist aging effects. You can begin doing this at any age, whether you are 18 or 81. It is never too late to build more reserves and slow the aging process. Love that quote, and really does a good job, I think, of summarizing the content of your book. Well, as you know, I ask all my guests to close out our conversation with a musical ending, a coda, by sharing a musical tool you wish more people knew about. It could be a book or a blog, an app, a therapeutic tool, or anything that enables you to enhance your life with music. Do you have a tool that you can share with us today in closing?
Yes. Well, the musical tool that I recommend, and I do myself, is dancing.
Ah,
I really recommend dancing, whether it's Zumba class in a gym or waltz classes in a ballroom class. I really recommend dancing because, in addition to stimulating multiple networks for emotions, for executive function, for connections, it also moves your body. See, when you're playing the piano or the guitar or the flute, you're sitting. And in music, when it's in the context of dancing, also moves your body. And personally, that's what gives me the, oh my God, I love this. When I do these turns and swings and do things with my wife, I love it. And I also realized that, for an hour I've been moving, I've been dancing, and, it's probably
yeah.
2,000 or 3,000 steps that I've done. So that's my favorite recommendation, is to learn dancing, whether it's Zumba class or cha-cha or modern dancing, and learn new steps, and you really have a full package. I can't think of any part of the brain that's not engaged when you're dancing. I can't
Mhm.
think of part of the brain. Maybe the language. If I'm not talking, unless I think that's the only part that's probably not as active. But all your brain is active when you're dancing.
Thank you so much to Dr. Fotuhi for giving us this science-backed, encouraging, and practical guide to maximizing our brain potential and cognitive reserve, wherever we may currently be on the brain spectrum. Listeners, be sure to get your hands on this incredible book and keep growing your brain this week through meaningful musical engagement, because it's never too late or too early to build brain reserve. There's a link in the show notes to this brand new book and other resources from our conversation. You'll also find a transcript and links to related episodes you may enjoy, including all episodes related to science and health. All Enhanced Life with Music episodes are evergreen, so check out the back catalog for more ways that music can make your life better. You can always connect with me on email, mindy@mpetersonmusic.com, Facebook, Instagram, X, or LinkedIn, and by signing up for my monthly newsletter. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you know of someone who would enjoy this episode, perhaps someone facing cognitive challenges, whether it's related to aging, ADHD, or concussion, or the people who care for them, please share this episode and book with them. It's easy to do right in your podcast listening app. Just tap the share feature for options to share by text, email, or social media. And if you're a book lover like me, I'll include a link in the show notes to all episodes featuring books and their authors, in case you're looking for more winter reading ideas. Thanks again for joining me today. Until next time, may your life be enhanced with music.